With that down, let's move on to our second main topic today. And our second main topic today gets submitted to us by Baron Greg, who writes, "Hey, John, I was reading a story about that deep fake video of Tom Holland and Robert Downey Jr. going around, and in it, Holland says that there have actually been real discussions about doing a Back to the Future reboot. Could something like this actually happen? Should it? And what do you think?" All right, thanks a lot for sending that in, man. And yes, amidst all the hoopla around those deep fakes that went out about, by the way, I'm pretty much over the deep fake stuff, but still, amongst all the hoopla that went out and around surrounding the Tom Holland and Robert Downey Jr. deep fakes of Doc Brown and Marty from Back to the Future, in all that, Tom Holland actually said something that I don't know that he was ever supposed to say, but he said the following. He said, "I'd be lying if I said there hadn't been conversations in the past about doing some sort of remake talking about Back to the Future. But that film is the most perfect film, or one of the most perfect films, one that couldn't be made better." So that's coming from Tom Holland. Now, the interesting part in there to me, obviously, is the part where he's saying, yeah, these discussions have happened. This has gone on. At some point, somebody from a studio actually had this idea, let's do a remake of Back to the Future, and got so far as, let's talk to some potential talent. That's how far these conversations went. It wasn't just, because narrowed down to the confines of the four walls of an executive office in a studio, millions of conversations happen. But it's only a certain percentage of those conversations that move on to the next stage where you actually reach out and start talking to some talent and saying, hey, if we did this, what would you think about this? And guess what? In Hollywood, ideas don't die. Sometimes they go into hibernation. Sometimes they go on vacation. Sometimes they go missing and don't get heard from decades. But basically speaking, ideas don't die in this town. It'll resurface at some point. And so we know now, because of what Tom Holland is saying, that there have been, at least at some point, a studio had interest in actually doing Back to the Future again. And I'm going to tell you right now, and this will be the unpopular opinion, I'm all for it. I'm all for it.
Boo.
I'm all for it. I'm all for it. And everybody should be all for it. And I will tell you why. Because of the same thing I say all the time about remakes in general. It has been statistically proven that when a reboot or a remake of a movie comes out, interest in the original film goes up. That is the worst possible thing that happens from a reboot coming out. The absolute worst scenario, the worst thing that can happen is interest in the original film goes up. Do you know how many more people saw the actual original Asian version of The Ring when the North American version came out? It skyrocketed. Do you know how many more people have actually seen the greatest cop movie of all time, Infernal Affairs, as a result of The Departed coming out? Now, The Departed's a bad example because that was also a great movie in its own right that won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. But if a reboot gets made, if they make another Back to the Future, and I would say this, and we mentioned this on yesterday's show, Aaron. Mm-hmm. If you do a reboot of Back to the Future, don't set it in the 80s and then going back to the 90s again.
Right.
There's no part of that. Because the brilliance of that movie was it took place in modern day and then a time shift. Do it, if you're going to reboot it, set it in the 2020s and then have them go back to the 80s or something. I mean, that would be an interesting new take on it. And if the movie's good, great. We have another new film to love and adore. And it'll just bring more attention to the original as well. And if the movie sucks, oh well, no harm, no foul, no worse than any other movie comes out that sucks. There's just no legitimate, tangible reason not to do it. Now, am I saying they should do it, Rob? Am I saying they should go out there and make a Back to the Future reboot? And if I was in charge of a studio, I probably wouldn't. But I have no problem if they do decide to do it. Now, of course, it brings up another question, Rob. We know the writer of the film, and I keep forgetting the name of the writer of the film.
Back to the Future?
Yeah.
Bob Gale.
Who's one of the guys who holds rights to it. And Bob Gale has said in the past, from my cold, dead hands, will you pry the rights to doing a remake and a reboot out of this? Now, of course, minds can change. We know that. But Bob Gale has said before, there's no chance in hell that as long as I live, you will do another one. But if conversations at a studio got to a point where they're even talking to talent, you have to believe that there must have been some sort of concession in there. But I don't know. Now we're getting into wild speculation. But Rob, I think Tom Holland probably said exactly what you would say. It's as close to a perfect movie as you can get. Why bother making it? First of all, what do you think about the fact that there have been discussions? And do you think this could ever happen? And then the third part is, although I know your answer is, how would you feel about them doing it?
Look, first of all, I should say I'm not against the idea of remakes. I think it's interesting when other countries remake other films. Like, for instance, Yojimbo and Sanjuro were remade for a fistful of dollars and a few dollars more with Clint Eastwood. Departed was Infernal Affairs. I like that. Our Ring was different than Ringu, the Japanese version.
Yeah, it was.
I like that. I like seeing different cultures' interpretations of movies. The Japanese remade Clint Eastwood's Forgiven as a samurai movie. So it's interesting. But to me, Back to the Future, there's I think a remake threshold that what can you bring to the property that'll be new? Like John Carpenter's The Thing, vastly different from the original 50s The Thing, went back to the original short story, very different movie, worked really well. Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, updating of the 50s version, great. David Cronenberg's The Fly, incredible film, very different from the original The Fly. I think that's okay. If they said Back to the Future was about Marty McFly going back, falling in love with his mother, and realizing he had an Oedipal complex the whole time and stayed with his mother in the past, and they had some psychosexual relationship, I'm like, yeah, man, I'll watch that shit. Show me that movie. But, if you're just going to go, then you get Colin Farrell in the remake of Total Recall, which they don't even go to Mars. Or you get a remake of RoboCop, which wasn't a bad movie.
It was actually not bad.
But you look at it and you're like, wouldn't you have, the Padilla, the director of the RoboCop movie, made the Elite Force, or Elite Squad, these Brazilian movies that kick ass. They bring him to America and they're like, you're going to do RoboCop. And it's like, this guy's amazingly talented and he's going to remake Verhoeven's RoboCop. And where did his career go after that? Not very far.
But it was a decent movie.
It was a decent movie. And
Michael Keaton was really good in it.
He was really good in it, but I'm like, it was unnecessary. And they could have made something original, utilizing the talents of all the people involved, and made something new and one for the ages. Give me an Oedipal Back to the Future, I'll watch it. It's not.
But that comes back to the thing we saw all the time. There are more original films that get made today than any other time in Hollywood history. I mean, so it's not like
it's true.
It's not like, by making that movie, it stopped another original movie. That's not the case. Tons of original movies get made. But, I mean, can they work out? But, you point out, look, sometimes, a remake and a reboot and a new attempt can actually become even better. Like, I think The Fly. Was better than the original.
Way better.
I think, you mentioned a couple as well. And then they can also be...
The Blob remake is really good.
But some can be absolute crap. I mean, there's no denying that. Some can be absolutely terrible, but I don't know. It'd be interesting, but there is no denying. I think even a lot of people who are okay with the idea of reboots, there are certain films, though, when come up in conversation that do have an air of, wait a minute, that one should be untouchable. And as weird as it is to think of it, I think Back to the Future is probably on that same shelf right beside The Godfather for a lot of people. So it would be... Oh, yeah.
Raiders.
So it would be really, really challenging for them to do it. Aaron, you hear about this, that they have actually had discussions that this could happen. Do you think there's a chance they could, like sometime within, say, the next 5 years, that they could actually make one of these things? And if so, how would you feel about it?
Well, let's be clear when we talk about having discussions. It's not like, because as you acknowledge, there are within the four walls of the studio, many things are lobbed about, blah, blah, blah. But, when you're at the status of Tom Holland as an actor, it's not like they're talking about these potential properties and then developing these properties and then going to Tom Holland's people and saying, we'd like to take a meeting with him in order to discuss a potential to do this other Back to the Future. They're in a meeting, they're hanging out, they're throwing a bunch of ideas around. They're also, talking to him about, what are your favorite movies? What influenced you growing up? And blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden, Back to the Future gets brought up. Oh my gosh, what would be really fun? If we did another Back to the Future and you played Marty McFly, blah, 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 the conversation goes on.
Yeah.
I can totally see that being the way that it was, brought up, because he does say, I'm not, I would be lying if I said it hadn't come up, but he didn't say, I took a meeting to discuss this possible movie. This was not something that they said, we need to talk to you specifically about this property.
We don't know that it wasn't.
Oh, well, okay. All right.
But we don't know that it was.
Right. The way
either.
that he phrases it, I get the idea that it was just sort of one of those things, in the same way that in one of those meetings, somebody say something about Julia Roberts playing
Harriet
Tubman. It's like these
one of the dumbest things ever.
These crazy things get brought up. But okay, well, first of all, Robert, though, you can't have Marty McFly with an Oedipal complex with his mom where they actually do get together, because then he's just going to dissolve. And he would probably dissolve at like the most inappropriate
but that's the climax
time.
of the movie. No pun
intended.
No pun intended.
That's only one version. That's only the version of time travel presented in the original Back to the Future. Since we're remaking it, it could be an alternate universe.
Yeah, they could pull a Marvel sort of thing.
Yeah,
and then alternate.
But that's very astute of you to say.
Let me ask
because
all three of you something.
But also one of the things. Okay, and yesterday I was on board with the idea of a 2020 Marty McFly going back to the 90s. I like your idea about him going back to the 80s a lot better, because going back to the 50s, there was a certain sense of utopia in the world that was presented.
It was American culture.
And, this Pleasantville kind of thing. And the 80s was such a wild time of excess and bright colors and just so much
Man, you know
so
what?
much consuming of capitalism, whereas the 90s, which I'm a child of the 90s, and I think of grunge and Nirvana and Pearl Jam and just hiding in the basement, and I don't think that's exact. I don't think going back to the 90s would be as fun and flavorful as going back to the 80s would be in a remake.
You just gave me a great idea. I want to see a kid of today going back to the time less than zero. Rich, Beverly Hills, coke addicted, disaffected. So you got some middle class kid from a good home in middle America, goes back to Beverly Hills of 1987, total excess, just becomes just a drug addict, and he has to save the future.
Meets the Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah, and he can't. He starts doing gay tricks and to make money, and the whole future depends on him saving the past, and he can't do it because he's just fallen into this horrible. It'd be a great indie film. Get Karen Kusama to direct it. It'd be like the Destroyer version of Back to the Future. I'd love it.
And then there would be something poetic too about going from like the 1920s to the 80s instead of the 90s, because that's when the
2020s.
To the 80s, because that's when the original Back to the Future started. So there's something poetic about that too. So I mean, then you can make an argument with that, then have a little bit of a Hot Tub Time Machine feel, probably, but I don't see that as a bad thing. I love the first Hot Tub Time Machine.
And also, I feel like people love time travel movies. They love the way. What?
But you're right. A lot of people do.
I love time travel.
I'm not big on time travel. Back to the Future and Star Trek: The Voyage Home are two giant exceptions for me. Those are two big exceptions. So I will make an exception for Back to the Future.
The Jetsons?
That's not time travel. That's
sorry.
just set in the future.
That is just true.
I mean, there might have been a time travel episode of that. I'm not sure.
They go back to the Flintstones.
We need to move on. So listen, guys, question is for you. Do you think that at some point, understanding that, a lot of big properties, they love to remake them in Hollywood, do you think that at some point we could get a remake of Back to the Future? And then how do you feel about that? Jump down to the comment section below and let us know your thoughts. All right.